Okay, welcome back. We've got Aeneid Book 10, one of my favourite books of the Aeneid, where we see key themes: God's war, Aeneas, youth dying. We finally, for those of us that are filled with bloodlust and enjoy a good dramatic description of death, we finally get lots and lots of fighting. We get my favourite death of the twins, the brothers that get their hands chopped off, and the hands are crawling around trying to find the other person. So book 10 is where it's really kicking off. We've had book 7 where we had Turnus gathering his army, and we get the catalogue of his heroes. We have book 8 where Aeneas gathers his army. We get book 9, which is a bit of chaos and the night raid and sort of a peaceful night. And now book 10, it's war proper. This is where Aeneas comes back into it and starts fighting. So some key moments in book 10. So the gods at the very beginning, they agree to withdraw. Whether that actually happens or not, we're going to discuss later. And they allow fate to take over. That's important because we will see, obviously, it gets rid of this excuse that one might have, or this criticism that one might have, that the Trojans only won the war because the gods were on their side. No, here the gods withdraw, and even though they withdraw, the Trojans will still win. And so it's sort of fated that Aeneas will win this war. We get Aeneas, he joins battle. He comes sort of on his speedboat, pushed by the nymphs, and finally joins battle. We get that Turnus kills Pallas. This is really, really important. Please, if you weren't aware that in book 10, Turnus kills Pallas, I don't know what you've been doing. You're a silly sausage. Please go back and read book 10. Aeneas, on his rampage, he tries desperately to avoid killing Lausus. And he was actually aiming for Mezentius, but he ends up killing Lausus and then has to kill Mezentius, Lausus's father, afterwards. Remember, Mezentius is that horrible, horrible man who was ousted by the Etruscans because he was sort of a tyrant, a despot, used to tie living people to dead people, so that's how they would be executed. He got ousted by the Etruscans and taken in by the Trojans, which is why the Etruscans are fighting on Aeneas' side. Quick recap there from book 8. So, book 10 is a really key book in terms of character development. There's two scholars here who point to Aeneas' development from book 2, where we see him as a sort of Homeric hero, and then we get his journey here becomes one of duty and self-sacrifice. We really see in Aeneas, we know that he is not massively motivated by the idea of the Roman Empire and founding the Roman race. This is sort of something that he remembers sort of when he is shown by the gods all of the future of Rome. He gets it, but he isn't 100% motivated. This gives him book 10 gives him a personal motivation in the death of Pallas, which really, really drives him on and makes him one of a true self-sacrificial hero. We even see our favourite supervillain, Mezentius. He becomes relatable. We even pity him. And these are the two scholars that you could pause, make a note of, use in your 30 markers that address this development of Aeneas' character in particular. So keep in the back of your mind character development for book 10. Okay, one of the first things that we come across then in book 10 in terms of our themes, gods and inevitably wrapped up in gods, we get fate, and inevitably wrapped up in fate, we get death. Reference to the OCR scholarship specification there, we need to know about the importance of fate and destiny, the role of the immortals, the relationship between the mortals and the immortals. This theme, in particular with goddesses, came up last year. So do I think it's going to come up again? Not particularly, but I certainly think it might be worded differently in terms of the importance of the gods in exacting fate and in the plot line of the Aeneid. So Jupiter takes a really key role in book 10. We see really the extent of his power. So firstly, he predicts the Punic Wars. If you skimmed over that in that first paragraph, go back and highlight it. It's really important. He predicts these Punic Wars, which is obviously this echo of Dido's curse from book 4. We're being reminded of the collateral damage that's already happened in order to found the Roman race, and the fact that this price will continue to grow in book 10. So by mentioning the Punic Wars, we're reminded of Dido, we're reminded of somebody that's already paid the price on Aeneas' mission, and therefore it puts that in our mind and we then get Pallas also gets added to this list of people that have paid the price. Remember back in book 1, Virgil tells us so heavy was the cost of founding the Roman race. The question that perhaps he is trying to answer or engage with is, was it worth it? And so Jupiter predicts these Punic Wars, picks up on the fact that Italy will have this massive big enemy in the future, and so why is it fighting now? He forbids the other gods to intervene. This doesn't really work. Venus intervenes, Juno intervenes, Juturna, who's Turnus's sister, a nymph intervenes. It's interesting that it's the females, the women goddesses in particular, that don't listen to Jupiter, and who even Jupiter cannot control. What is Virgil trying to say here about women? Even goddesses, they are uncontrollable sometimes. If they get obsessed, there is no stopping them. So we get a key moment before Lausus dies, in which we see the humans also, the gods, pitying the humans. And so Jupiter has this moment where he reminds us of this human mortality. And this is one of the key elements and one of the key roles of the gods, is to highlight the difference between the gods and the mortals. And the obvious difference between the gods and the mortals is that the mortals are mortal and they will die. And so death is something that the gods almost look down upon but cannot relate to, because they won't experience it themselves. So we get this moment just before Lausus dies, in which we see them pity the futility of humans. So the gods in Jupiter's hall pitied the useless anger of them both, and that such pain existed for mortal beings. So there's this difference between the gods' anger and human anger, and human suffering are all part of war. Whereas the gods, their anger has very little consequence. It's sort of just like a child having a tantrum. It's not going to do anything. And we see, whilst you could use this to argue that the gods don't have any sort of real empathy for the mortals, we get this scene between Jupiter and Hercules just before Pallas dies, in which Jupiter sort of reflects on the nature of man, and he says that the course of life is brief and cannot be recalled, and so the human's day of death is set, and so it is important, therefore, to increase fame by deeds. So this is the pressure that mortals feel, in that our time is limited on Earth, and so we must do something impressive to make our sort of name live on, and so that we can achieve that kleos. And Jupiter reminds us back of the Iliad and book 16, in which Sarpedon dies, and he pities Sarpedon as well. Our next key theme. So we've got fathers and sons. This is a real key theme in book 10. From the OCR spec, it could come up under family and friendships, the relationships between parents and children. So it's interesting that in the specification, it's not just fathers and sons. It says parents and children. However, I would urge you to think, how often do we really see mothers? Creusa gets killed off very quickly. Euryalus' mum is just there for a little bit. We don't see very many mums. Even Pallas's mum, she's dead. She's not with us anymore. We pretty much see fathers and sons. And this theme is particularly important within the Augustan context as well, for these reasons. So number one, it establishes the legitimacy of his power. Remember, Augustus has been adopted into Julius Caesar's family. Julius Caesar was his great uncle. By strengthening that idea that Julius Caesar was his father, it strengthens his claim to power, which was challenged to some extent by Mark Antony. It also validates his vengeance in terms of avenging the killers of Julius Caesar. That was one of his first things that he did when he came to power, was seek out and make sure that all of the people that were involved in the conspiracy against Julius Caesar were killed. And he was quite brutal with this. He killed them without trial. And it was something that you could perhaps criticize him for, but he very much took pains in his PR campaign to frame it as him being a decent son, and avenging your father's wrongs is something that you should do as a decent son. However, it also raises questions in terms of his future rule. And remember, we talked about this in book 6. He doesn't have a legitimate heir. He might have some illegitimate sons, everyone that he keeps adopting in order to take over his rule dies. And there is this question over Augustus's future rule after he dies and his succession. So remember, we're reading this with two eyes, that Virgil could be bringing this idea of fathers and sons to the fore as an implicit criticism of Augustus, in terms of him not being able to bear a legitimate son. Where else do we see this theme coming through? It's important to note, obviously, like I've just said, women to a large degree are cast aside in the Aeneid. They are pretty much there as vessels for babies or madness in the Aeneid, and in Rome in general. The important line here is the male one. That is the one through which your name and your blood and your citizenship gets passed on. So the first father-son relationship that we actually see it with Turnus and Daunus. So Turnus gets removed from war, supposedly, ostensibly, so for his father. We see him get put onto a boat chasing a phantom of Aeneas. He runs away. He gets so distressed by this. And the reason that Juno gives us is to save him for his father. So we get this idea that Turnus is this sort of devout son. And yet, in doing so, in removing him from battle, he's just sort of portrayed as a coward. And Turnus actually, he goes against or blemishes this sort of holy father and son relationship when he kills Pallas, because he says to Pallas, I'm sending your father back the son he deserves. And so he invokes Pallas's father, and in a terrible, terrible way. This goes against this idea of father and sons. It shows that perhaps he doesn't really respect this father-son relationship. We see it very clearly as well, obviously, with Lausus and Mezentius. This sort of is an example of an eventual father-son relationship. Remember, when we get introduced to Lausus in book 8, we're told that he deserved a better father than the one he had. So Lausus was a good boy, Mezentius was a terrible man, and this really, really comes to the fore, and Virgil stops and apostrophizes Lausus when he does so. But when Mezentius is being attacked, Lausus intervenes, protects him, allows him to get out of battle, and we get this unnatural order of things where the son dies before the father. And then Mezentius, he finally comes in, and obviously attempts to avenge his son's death because he realizes that it's not proper and he's been a terrible father this whole time. And then our final father-son relationship that we get is this sort of pseudo father-son relationship between Aeneas and Pallas, where Aeneas has been told that he has to look after Pallas. We get Pallas looking up to Aeneas while Aeneas is sailing at the very beginning of the book. Pallas is asking all sorts of questions about the way of the world, and Aeneas is teaching him like a father teaches a son. And obviously when Pallas dies, the first thing that flashes through Aeneas' mind is Evander and this duty that he owed to Evander. We know that obviously when Pallas dies, he says, whether I beat you or whether I die right now, is what he says to Turnus, my father will bear each fate equally. We know that that isn't true because Evander has already said, if you're going to die, kill me now. And so we know that Evander would rather have Pallas there, but Pallas dies, and we can predict this, that we will see Evander's reaction to that in book 11, and we'll see that. This idea of it being a pseudo father-son relationship with Aeneas and Pallas, it fills Aeneas with guilt, but it also fills him with this justifiable, this righteous furor. Remember, we talked about the idea of furor being justified in some instances. Here, Aeneas is allowed to be justifiably angry, and he goes on a rampage, and it justifies all of his killing. So Pallas's death functions very, very importantly in dragging Aeneas into the war and really committing to it. Now, thinking of war, obviously this is one of our first big war books. The portrayal of war is one of your key themes in OCR, and we've got sort of a positive and a negative view. And most of the time, if you get an essay on war, you're going to be asked to weigh up whether it's a positive or a negative thing. There was an essay a few years ago that was sort of, it's bleak and it's depressing with all of the war and the death. Do you agree? To see war as just a bad thing is a little bit one-dimensional. Remember, the Romans, as they were creating this poem, were the most powerful people in the world. They had occupied many, many countries, and you don't do that through peace negotiations. You do that through war. It was the manly thing to be trained in war. It was the manly thing to have gone to war. It was a very integral part of Roman life, and so there had to be something positive about it. And this poem has to show it in some form of a positive light, but it will be a complicated light. Virgil does not do just like one-dimensional. Yes, that's a positive thing. Yes, that's propaganda. Yes, Aeneas is a good boy. He creates intricate, complicated characters. So how is war predicted as a positive thing in this book? I'm just going to summarize a few ways in which I think it's positive or negative. So we get these really long, interesting, original, very visceral descriptions of war fighting and death. And you could say that's a negative thing, but I think that if he's dedicating so many lines to poetry about it, he's involving so many similes, he's creating so much variation. This is a moment for Virgil to really flex his poetic muscles. And that makes it seem like a good, interesting, violent, but quite sort of almost cathartic description of war. We see Aeneas, when he arrives gloriously on his ship, he rallies his men take heart in this. Aeneas' arrival in war spurs on his men, and this is then reflected again when Pallas sees all of his men. He sees all of his men retreating, and Pallas gives this massive speech, and it fills his men with shame and remorse and drives them on into battle. And so we see that war is this opportunity for brilliant leadership with men. And we see it with Aeneas, and then we see it reflected on a smaller scale with Pallas. And so it makes men be their best in war. We also get Virgil's apostrophes. Again, pay attention to where a poet slows something down or gives it a lot of detail. He's telling us as an audience this is important. He apostrophizes both Pallas and Lausus before their death and after their death, and he praises their glory, and he also praises how many people they killed in battle. He says to Pallas, look, your first day brought you into battle and your first day takes you out, but in the meantime you've left behind piles of dead. And we'll see that again gives comfort to Evander when he gets Pallas's body back in Book 11. So men are honoured by their feats in war. And then we get Aeneas' glorious sprees. Like I've said, it's justified by his desire for vengeance and his commitment to that Xenia that he had, that Xenia agreement, that dextro agreement that he had with Evander. Again, this is a sort of moment where Aeneas gets his excellent moment of excellence. He'll get many more moments of excellence, Aristeia, but it's justified here. It is a righteous way of doing it. And we see him just essentially being a good father and a good Roman and a good person dedicated to his people. So they're the ways in which we can spin that war is a positive thing. It's more obvious, I think, in the ways that war is portrayed as a negative thing. So like I've gone through already, the gods pity the slaughter of these humans, and even the horses are terrified by Aeneas' anger. And back in the Iliad, Homer often used horses as a way of like expressing emotional truth or psychological truth. And here even the horses fear Aeneas and his anger on the battlefield, which shows, one could argue how excellent and formidable he is, or one could argue how much he has fallen off the other end of humanity and how he is now this animalistic sort of person in terms of his furor. And that ties into my second point. Bloodlust and war makes men forget their pietas. We see it with Turnus, and when he takes Pallas's baldric, his sword belt, and we get an apostrophe again from Virgil where he says Turnus will regret this. Oh no, we don't get it from Virgil. Jupiter says it when he looks down on him. So we see Turnus, he takes the gerras, which he shouldn't be doing, and he wears it. He also, when he kills Pallas, he puts his foot on the body. He desecrates the body to pull his sword out. And we see it with Aeneas as well. Aeneas goes on this rampage in which he captures men to be human sacrifices. Might remind us of Achilles when he takes people when Patroclus has died. But for a Roman, a human sacrifice is disgusting. It is so sacrilegious. It is so blasphemous. And so these two men in their war and their bloodlust and their heightened emotions, their furor, they forget their pietas. And that is the impact of war. We also see it with the loss of youth. We see Aeneas, he's so reluctant to kill Lausus. He says, why are you rushing to your death? Why are you in such a hurry to die? And he tries so hard not to kill Lausus. He tries so hard, keeps pushing him away, keeps sort of using his shield to take his arrows. He doesn't want to kill Lausus. And we see this loss of youth and also the impact on those around the dead youth, which will be continued in Book 11, where we see Evander's reaction to Pallas's death. So by allowing not only the youth to die, but also for us to see the impact on those around them, we see the negative side of war. Okay, the last final thing that I want to focus on is just assessing Aeneas' character, which you could come up as both a 20 marker and a 30 marker. So in what ways, let's just analyse his heroism at the moment in Book 10. So on the one hand, he is favoured by the gods and the men. We get the nymphs drive him forward towards battle, and that rallies the men. The men are behind him every single way. Remember, when a Roman goes to war, they need to have the Senate and the people of Rome behind them, and we see that Aeneas has that in the same way that Augustus did on the shield in Book 8. We see this exceptional fighting skill, and we could argue one way or the other, but you can certainly justify that it is motivated by this idea of righteous furor, this justifiable anger because of Pallas's death. He challenges those that are his equal. So when he kills Lausus, he hasn't originally gone for Lausus. He has gone for Mezentius because Mezentius is his equal. He's an older man. He's a bigger soldier. Aeneas knows that by challenging and killing Lausus, that would be like picking on a small boy, and there's no glory to be won from that. So Aeneas challenges people that are just his equal, and when he has to kill people that are not his equal, such as Lausus, he treats the dead really well. Remember, he picks up Lausus' body. He doesn't allow his hair to get even sullied by the dirt or the blood. He picks him up and carries him back to his people. So he treats the dead so well, and he gives it back to them. That really is an example of his absolute pietas in battle. And he allows his victims to speak their wishes. So when just before Mezentius dies, Mezentius says, "Please let me be buried with my son." We don't know if Aeneas does that or not. We don't see what happens to Mezentius after this, but he gives his victims time, and he doesn't taunt them. If anything, he sort of tells them to go away. He doesn't really want to engage with war. He's focused on Turnus. As soon as he hears that Pallas is dead, he focuses his laser vision on Turnus. It's going to take us 2 more books until we actually get their proper big clash. But he wants vengeance, and he wants to make things equal. He doesn't want needless slaughter. On the other hand, we have Turnus. And remember what Edith Hall says, we justify our barbarians because it said, by saying something about ourselves, we describe the barbarians as the opposite of ourselves. And so Turnus serves to be the foil, the antithesis to Aeneas. He mocks his victims. He mocks Pallas when he dies, says, this is what your dad always wanted. Meh, meh. He's horrible to him. He takes the garrison, he wears it, which is not okay. And when he kills Pallas is not his equal. And we get told very clearly that Pallas and Lausus, remember throughout Book 10, if you go back and check where they sort of are in the battle, Virgil constantly makes this comparison between Pallas and Lausus, draws them together, and then pulls them apart. It's like these two men are sort of attached by an elastic band throughout Book 10. They're constantly coming within reaching distance of each other. That would be a fair fight, Pallas versus Lausus. They come within kissing distance of each other, and then they're dragged apart again. And Virgil tells us that both men were destined to be killed by heroes greater than themselves. Aeneas kills Lausus, but he doesn't want to, and he's aware that it's an unequal battle, whereas Turnus loves it. Turnus sees that Pallas is an unequal battle and is like, yeah, I'm going to do this. And so he picks on somebody that's not his own size. So we see Turnus becoming less heroic as Aeneas becomes more heroic, and they serve to oppose each other and highlight each other's differences. Thanks for listening. Book 11 next week, hopefully. Good luck with your mocks.